Hi, we are in Module 5. We are talking about complicated and traumatic losses, and what I wanted to speak to you today was my truth. What happened to me when I lost my daughter? Now, I've lost people in life before. I've had people die and had reactions, but having lost a 16-year-old, and that was in 2005, so I am able to look back on it a little bit. I can see a difference. I can see a difference between that loss and the loss of other people in my life. And I just wanted to share that with you so in this part of this module, you might be able to have a more personal viewpoint of it. You know, in a million years, you never think that's going to happen to you. And like every other parent, I said at some point, oh, I could never survive. I would never survive if anything happened to my children. But when it happens, the amazing thing that shocks you is that your heart continues to beat, that you continue to get up, you continue to try to go to sleep at night. And as the days pile up, you realize that somehow you survive. But as I go on, I think about some things that we've been talking about that did happen to me. They talk about how grief can cause a physical illness. I had this strange thing happen shortly after, maybe a month after my daughter passed away. I started to develop absolutely excruciating pain in my knees. I'd had some knee surgery before, but certainly not in both knees. In the long run, I ended up having a series of treatments done and it resolved, but you know, there was no other reason for that to happen. I had no injuries, so I have to attribute that to grief. Another thing I noticed that I've never noticed in myself before is that I constantly was sighing, like, and it's something that I've talked to other grieving parents about, mothers and fathers, and they experienced a similar thing. So I'm not quite sure if that's a lack of oxygen to the brain or just a calming reflex, but it was something I hadn't experienced before. I also became aware of how much I can multitask because I could contribute. I could do my entire day, teach classes, keep the house clean, everything, and never stop thinking of her for that first year. There's also the obsessions part that you may have remember from when we talked about the symptoms of complicated grief. And I wouldn't say that I'm still doing that. I think that was the first year or two that I just needed to read everything about what happened to my daughter. I needed to understand it. I needed to understand everything there was to say about death and what people thought happened, the afterlife. I needed to understand if psychics worked. I read books on autopsies. I had to understand every part of it. I know other people who have had the exact opposite reaction, but that was mine, which goes to show about how personal it is. I even went out and spoke to groups about what had happened, and I'm not sure where that energy came from because I'm not sure 14 years later that I have as much energy to do that as I did then. I often tell people that what happens when you lose a child is it's parenthood interrupted. Motherhood, fatherhood, grandparenthood interrupted. I'm not sure that it matters how old your child was because once you're a parent, you're always a parent. My daughter was 16, so for that reason, I knew I still had years of parenting left, and so it really felt like I had lost those years. The other thing that I wanted to talk about real quick was that fear that a lot of parents have that you may hear in your work as a social worker or a professional provider, that people fear they'll forget their child. They'll forget how they sounded, what they felt like, all their memories. You know, I can tell you all these years later, you don't forget, but it is a big fear of parents who've lost a child. The other thing that happened was that there's a lot of fear about the day that you don't think about them constantly. Or in my case, there was a fear that I would stop crying. And I remember the first day that I did, and I reached out to my support group and they were very helpful, but I do remember that. So I've talked about the loss of my daughter in several modules. And I know some of you may know me, but for all of you, I'd like to give you a challenge, and I'll give an extra point for this if you can email me. What is the name of my daughter? If you Google out there, you do some research, I'm pretty sure that you'll find it, and if you could let me know how you found it. And thank you very much for listening to me and letting me share my story.